What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing something really important and something which is very interesting. Today we're going to be looking at why Ryzen processors are so cheap compared to Intel and they still deliver better performance. So let's dive right in. So for over a decade, Intel has been dominating the CPU market with their Core series of processors, but in 2017 that all changed when AMD launched their new Ryzen lineup of processors. It delivered more cores and more threads for the same price as an Intel quad-core processor. So who would turn that deal down? Okay, so let's start by looking how AMD makes their processors cheaper than Intel but still offers better performance. So if we look at AMD, as you can see, I've pulled up a picture of their processor, but what you don't see is what is under this IHS or integrated heat spreader. So let's look what's under it. So as you can see two different kinds of chips, right? So don't get me wrong here, there are not two different processors inside this. It's just the same processor split into two. So what this does is it basically saves AMD a lot of money because less silicon is wasted while manufacturing it. So now guys, we'll look at how the chiplets communicate and how they work. So let's start with how they communicate. Now AMD has been very intelligent and has implemented something known as an infinity fabric. Basically what this is it's an high-speed interconnect between both the chiplets, so it reduces latency. Now the speed at which this infinity fabric runs is measured in something known as the F clock, also known as the infinity fabric clock. Now this F clock runs at the speed of your RAM. So as we all know, DDR4 or double data rate 4 means you have to halve your RAM speed to get your actual RAM speed. So for example, let's say you have a RAM kit that is 3000 megahertz and your actual RAM speed would be 3000 divided by 2, which is 1500 megahertz. Your RAM runs at half the rated speed because that is what DDR4 does. It halves your RAM speed and runs it at that. So that's why it's known as double data rate, which basically means it's double the data rate that the RAM is actually running at, if you guys know what I mean. The maximum speed at which the F clock can run at is 1800 megahertz. So to run it at that speed, you will need to have RAM that is fast enough to keep up with that. So that would be 3600 megahertz RAM because 3600 divided by 2 is 1800 megahertz, right? So you need to have 3600 megahertz speed memory to take full advantage of Ryzen. So that is the reason many people keep telling you that you need to go for faster RAM in Ryzen processors. But why doesn't this matter in Intel? Well, Intel doesn't have chiplets or an infinity fabric. It only has one single processor on the silicon. Okay, now let's talk overclocking. Those of you who don't know, overclocking basically means running your computer PC components on speeds that is rated higher than what is specified by the manufacturer. For example, if my processor is rated to run at 4.5 GHz, then I can overclock it to 4.6 GHz. But what this does is it generates more heat, so you would need a better cooling solution if you would want to overclock. Now, how do you overclock in Ryzen? Well, in Ryzen you can overclock two things. You can overclock the processor itself and you can also overclock the infinity fabric. So, Ryzen processors can be overclocked in two ways. One can be done through the BIOS, or two, it can be done from Windows using the Ryzen Master software. So, I prefer doing it in the Ryzen Master software because it just gives you more control. Basically, what Ryzen Master does is it tells you which core is performing the best or which CCX or chiplet is performing the best. And looking at that, I can apply my overclocks and optimize it so that my best cores are boosting higher than the lower performing cores. So really good stuff from Ryzen. And if you want to overclock from BIOS, you can do that as well. And you can apply individual overclocks to each of the cores, of course, from the BIOS, but you don't know which core is working the best, so it's totally up to your choice. Okay, so now let's talk about overclocking the Infinity Fabric. Again, this can be done from the Ryzen Master software as well as the BIOS, but there's not really that much of a difference if you want to overclock from both of those, because Ryzen Master just gives you the same control as what the BIOS does. So the Infinity Fabric, as far as I know, you cannot overclock it that much, and you don't get such a stable system even after overclocking it. So as I told you before, it runs at 1800 megahertz. You could probably give it like a 50 to 100 megahertz offset, but I don't think it'll be that stable, so I don't recommend overclocking it unless you really want to do it. Okay, now let's look at the conclusion. So as far as my opinion, I really recommend Ryzen over Intel because it's just offering way more value for money. So if you look at the current lineup of Intel and Ryzen, so let's start with the cheapest that Intel and Ryzen have to offer. Ryzen offers the Ryzen 3 lineup and Intel offers the i3 lineup. I really recommend going for the Ryzen 3 because the recently launched Ryzen 3 3300X, it actually exceeds the performance of the i7 7700K. That processor was a flagship just like 2-3 years ago. So Ryzen just killing it in the budget range. And then let's look at the mid-range, what I like to call the mid-range, or the i5 lineup from Intel, as well as the Ryzen 5 lineup from AMD. So here it's just your wish, because this is really the sweet spot for Intel 10th gen. So don't go for the 10500, go for the 10400 or 3600. Both perform really well. And if you want a bit more overclocking headroom, then go for the 3600X. And if you want to overclock in Intel, just go for the 10600K. So this is the only range where Intel is starting to give some competition. So nice work, Intel. Now let's move on to the high-end options, or mid to high-end options as I'd like to call it. You have the Ryzen 7 lineup from AMD and the i7 lineup from Intel. Now again, Ryzen 7 is basically winning this because the i7 10700K is just a discounted version of the i9 9900K. It's basically an i9 9900K in disguise. So I really recommend going for the Ryzen 7 3700X because it just offers more value. And you're still getting 8 cores and 16 threads for like $270, I guess it's right now. So now let's move on to the high-end range, which is the Ryzen 9 3900X from AMD. We're not going to be talking about the 3950X because that's on a whole new range of its own, so we're not going to be talking about that. And as far as Intel is concerned, the 10900K and the 10900, and here again AMD is winning because in productivity you've got 2 extra cores and 4 extra threads, and you really benefit from it. Like, it's not like a marginal difference, a huge difference. And in the i9 has only 10 cores and 20 threads. It's nothing to scoff at, but compared to AMD, it is really less. And AMD is offering 12 cores at a lesser price than Intel. So I don't need to tell who's clearly the winner here, just go for AMD. The only reason I'd recommend Intel right now is if you want reliability over performance, because if you're going for a server or something like that, then please go for Intel because it's just way more reliable. But if you're going for like your average consumer's desktop, if you're building one, just go for Ryzen. Just way more performance for the price you're paying. So that was the conclusion, guys. That's it for this video, guys. A lot of time went into making it, so a like and subscribe is really appreciated. Until the next video, it's Nikhil signing off from Nikhil Talks Tech. Peace.